balmy evening here on the banks of Lake Bacalar in Mexico, and I'm joined tonight by a phalanx of icons. Um, Anthony Fauci will not be the determining factor in our evolution, but I can tell you, not for want of trying, the biohacking and the soul hacking and all the rest of the luciferic nonsense that we can attribute to the medical science establishment, the status quo is what it is. It is patently obvious to any human being with a pulse. The individuals joining me tonight are at the very vanguard of change. And I do believe, without getting too flowery, that history will shortly reflect over its shoulder at these icons as being the very tip of the spear of paradigmatic shift in our social ecology, in our political ecology, and as it relates to the survival of humanity altogether. When you consider the horrors of what has been taking place through public health administration and through the subversion of mainstream academia and government all around the world by these globalist agendas. And I would step into far darker territory and speak in terms of ritual sacrifice of innocence, the harvest of humanity, Canaanite ritualism, dream spell, spell binding, all of the grisly, ghastly stuff that, frankly, friends, we have been subjected to for millennia, but are only now awakening from the thrall. I'm going to quickly do a rundown on these icons. Dr. Judy Mykovits is best known for appearing in the Plandemic movie series and having co-authored 50 plus publications and book chapters. She's a best-selling author of the book Plague of Corruption, A Plague and the Case Against the Masks, and Ending Plague, a scholar's obligation in an age of corruption. She's one of my true heroes. Judy, very happy to have you here this evening.
Lovely to be back, Sacha. Nice to be here.
And you've got your red cap on, I see. I can't quite read what it says. It says love. Delightful. Thanks, Judy, for being here. Dr. Reiner Fuellmich, a trial lawyer specializing in banking and stock exchange law, private international law, and medical law. And in July 2020, as many of you, certainly all of my audience will know, Dr. Reiner, together with Vivian Fisher, founded the Corona Investigative Committee, which has since interviewed over 170 experts, specialists, scientists, medical professionals, and activists around the globe. Reiner, very, very happy to make your acquaintance today.
Thank you very much for having me.
And yes, indeed, we agreed a little earlier that he is indeed joining an enclave of lumberjacks who are hewing at the taproots of a satanic globalist elite. So thank you for your service. Patrick Wood is a leading and critical expert on historic and modern technocracy, transhumanism, sustainable development. He is an economist, a financial analyst, and a lecturer who has studied elite globalization policies since the late 1970s. Well, you wouldn't think it looking at him because he doesn't look that old. An expert on New World Order by several world leaders. And Patrick Wood is a frequent speaker and guest on radio shows around the world. And delighted to make your acquaintance tonight, sir.
Hey, this is wonderful to be together. I'm really glad you're doing this and that we have an opportunity to tell our story just one more time.
Indeed, indeed. Finally, Dr. Richard M. Fleming is the author of the Fleming Inflammation and Heart Disease Theory, known as Fleming Theory. First presented in 1994, he's the inventor and patent holder of the Fleming Method for tissue and vascular differentiation and metabolism, using some state single or sequential quantification comparisons. Well, that might be a bit of a mouthful to a layman like me, but I rather suspect that this is the haystack wherein we find the needle, wherein we find that all roads indeed lead to Rome. Very, very happy to meet you, Dr. Fleming. Let me see if I can find you. There you are.
My pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
And on your left, on my right, and the audience's right, and your left is Nash, who is, I believe, driving force behind the Crimes Against Humanity USA tour.
Thank you for having us. Very happy to be here.
Thank you. Nash, I'm going to throw it at you first, and then I'm going to go in for the kill with the other icons here. What is the tour about, ABC?
The tour is about accountability. It is about holding these perpetrators accountable for crimes against humanity. These are crimes against humanity. This tour is about presenting evidence. It's about giving you the big picture. It's about answering all the questions that people ask and sometimes can't understand. I think Patrick Wood is probably, he's our first speaker. He's the one that actually takes you through the New World Order and this plan that has been going on for many, many years. There's a question that never gets answered. If you had to tell people, listen, this is a huge agenda that's been going on for many, many years, they will say, how could a small group of people influence the whole world? How could they snap their fingers and get the whole world to actually play along like an orchestra? I think Patrick Wood answers that question. He is the foundation of the actual tour in terms of the information. And then we go on to Dr. Judy Mikovits, who is probably the leading expert in terms of exposing these people right from the very beginning. The movie, the pandemic, I think, has awakened more people than most. And then, of course, we've got Dr. Reiner Fuellmich, who comes in from the legal perspective and from the civil perspective with the Coronavirus Investigative Committee, presenting absolute evidence from over 150 people that he's interviewed, medical and legal professionals. And then we finish off with Dr. Fleming, who is the finishing touch in terms of indictments, in terms of going after these people, especially in the USA. The Crimes Against Humanity tour has been chosen first to be in the USA because if we win the USA and if we get them to be accountable here, then the stranglehold on the whole world will be literally over. So this tour is about getting indictments, it's about action, and it's about awakening the American people to what is happening. When people are not informed, they will make the wrong decisions. And basically with these vaccines, I think that's what we've seen. So that's the tour. It's about explaining to people, it's about getting them to understand what is happening and then mobilizing them into action.
Very good. Thank you very much indeed for that overview. So jumping straight in, I want this to be as succinct and informative for our audience as possible. And we're planning to syndicate this very, very widely in the next few days to do everything we can to support this very noble endeavor. I scarcely recovered from a 3-month tour coast to coast of the United States last year, which took down many of us. The toll at the end of our tour was 6 people dead, and I'm not joking. Some people close to us know what it takes. I don't suggest for 1 second that any of these great angelic beings here are going to be suffering any grisly fate on their tour. I think they're protected by a divine a cloud of luminescence for sure. Dr. Judy, let me start with you. Your research at the NIH led to the isolation and characterization of a new family of human disease-associated retroviruses, XMRVs, HGRVs. Can you explain how you discovered that the XMRV virus was present in the MMR, polio, and encephalitis vaccines given to American children and soldiers? Let's start there.
Well, I don't know that I'd say I discovered it was present, but what I did with people with these neuroimmune, neurological diseases, autism, certain cancers, is we did what we usually do. We looked for a signature of disease. We looked for that cytokine storm that is the expression of the family of viruses, appreciating the biochemical pathways that they dysregulate. And so because, bats are big flying rats that have that type 1 interferon response ready to go, doesn't have to go through transcription, translation, and they're nocturnal animals, they're in the dark. So in the dark, they don't have to generate the energy that it takes to be in the light, as we know. So we just simply knew from Dr. Rossetti, my mentor, we knew the disease-causing entities. They're called murine leukemia virus, related viruses, retroviruses. So they were discovered as sequences on a on a genomic on a PCR test that Joe DeRisi devised that was an entire genome-wide scale. And Bob Silverman, whose expertise was a protein and the pathways of RNA cell, that's an enzyme that clips up RNA viruses that particularly become RNA DNA hybrids. It's interesting that they'd been studying that pathway in aggressive prostate cancers, because at the time I was doing research at the National Cancer Institute and at Epigenics Pharmaceuticals in Santa Barbara, developing therapeutics targeting epigenetic viruses that dysregulated the epigenetic machinery. And these viruses, we saw their paper in 2006. We knew the receptor was a G protein-like receptor that was a transmembrane phosphate transporter. We linked up, we're talking with Stephanie Seneff over the years. So basically, we look at the biology. It's not the virus. It's what is the cytokine storm, the signature of disease. And it's the exact cytokine storm of disease of Ebola from 2014, which we had been growing in the Vero monkey kidney cell line. I'm actually the one that developed Vero E6. It's a clone. It's a single limiting dilution clone in a 96 well plate, where you just plate out a single cell and ask which cell grows the virus that normally kills cells the best. And so we know about Ebola, the signature of disease. We published in the 90s. It happened to be the exact signature of disease of the XMRVs. It happens to be the exact signature of disease of COVID. And again, it's a cover up of and murder of 40 years of vaccine injury. And so we knew who the susceptible were. And I guess the heretical finding that, something that caused prostate cancer would cause neuroimmune disease. Well, of course, because you appreciate the microglia, you appreciate the biology. And that was not my first rodeo with the role of monocytes in disease. That was my PhD thesis. Right. HIV doesn't cause AIDS if you keep the monocyte macrophage. This is our colleague, Candace Pert, who discovered peptide T. It blocked the interaction between the monocyte and the T cell, the subject of the Dallas Buyers Club, the movie. I mean, I just simply grew up in a lab doing the experiments with the luminaries like the doctors Rossetti and Candace Pert. It's not rocket science.
Very good. Your boss, Dr. Anthony Fauci, or erstwhile boss, Dr.
He
Anthony
was never
Fauci,
my boss.
Ordered you to keep your mouth shut. And when you refused, he illegally confiscated your workbooks and hard drives, drove you from government work, and blackballed you from receiving grants, essentially ending your career. Where do you find the courage that you find, Judy, in the face of adversity for so long?
Well, he funded all our research, so he removed our funding. He was never my boss. I never worked for him. I was National Cancer Institute and at Epigenics Pharmaceuticals and at the Whittemore Peterson Institute. I was simply receiving R01 and other types of small business loans, SBIR grants to fund those forward. There's not courage necessary. What he was always doing was illegal, unethical, and immoral. And fine, you can have warrants out for my being a fugitive from justice. You can do anything you wanted, but at the end of the day, the way I was raised, it's like, silence equals death. I learned that in HIV, and I'll never shut up. And I really don't care what Tony Fauci says.
Well, thank you for clarifying that. Boom, 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 boom. Reiner, if I can bring you in. For those not yet familiar, please explain briefly what the Corona Investigative Committee is and how it got started.
Well, this is how it got started. my wife and I were still staying and living at our ranch in Northern California when in March of 2020, we started getting all these strange phone calls from our friends and relatives about something that we'd never heard before, the lockdowns, etc. And I decided that we should stay there and sit things out. My wife didn't want me to do that. She wanted me to go back. She said, "You know how to fight these big corporations." I didn't even know that we were going to deal with big corporations, but that's what it turned out to be. And I got in touch with a good friend of mine who stopped the swine flu, which is the precursor of this pandemic, I guess, Dr. Wolfgang Wodark, and asked him what is his take on this. And he says, well, this looks like the swine flu 2.0, only it looks much worse. So you're going to have to come back. We're going to have to do something. I asked him if there's anyone else, any other lawyer in Germany who would join me. And it took a while until finally he said, yes, there's this one woman, and that's Vivian Fischer, who's also an attorney. And she and I then decided after I returned to Germany that we would set up this Corona investigative committee because we did not expect to get any answers from our government or from the mainstream media. The three basic questions that we wanted answers to is, one, how dangerous is the virus really? Two, how reliable is the PCR test? And three, how dangerous, how much damage do the anti-corona measures do? Most of all, of course, recently, the so-called vaccinations, which are not vaccinations because they don't give you any immunity. In the meantime, as you said, we have spoken to more than 150, I think even close to 170 experts from all walks of science, including psychiatrists and psychologists who describe the psychological terrorism that drives all this, but also media people whose media, the mainstream media, is the most important vehicle to convey the message of panic and fear. But of course, this includes people from the medical field, like Dr. Mike Yeadon, a good friend who is a former vice president of Pfizer, their chief science officer for 16 years, Dr. Robert Malone, the man who invented mRNA vaccine technique. And as a result of this, we have come to the conclusion, and again, I have to say this over and over again. If somebody had told me this 2 years ago, I would have told them, go take your pills, go see a doctor, things will be fine. But we've come to the conclusion that this never had anything to do with health, but rather this is a long-planned agenda about some very few people, super rich psychopaths, I guess you could call them, who are using hundreds of thousands of people who they either bribe or put under pressure to do their bidding. So the ultimate goal is to keep the general population in a panic mode for so long until finally they will relent and give in to their desires, which means introducing a one world government, because as we can see, our own governments, which I know now are not really our own governments anymore, can't cope with all these with corona pandemic or with what's going on in Ukraine. And the other major goal that they're after is the introduction of a new one world digital currency designed according to the Chinese social credit system. So once you know that, you have to change your view and you have to change your approach. It is not, as I learned this morning when we had the Corona Investigative Committee's session, it is not so much about are the measures proportional or are there different methods of treatment? Yes, that's part of the problem, but the real problem is that the people who have staged this are not making any mistakes. They're not negligent. They're not incompetent. Rather, they're acting with intent, and that includes that they don't mind if people die.
Well, that's true, but they're in abrogation and derogation of every aspect of rule of law, alpha, omega, and how they manage to continue to get by confounds me. I mean, at what point do we kick doors down, drag these devils into the market square and string them up by the neck, which is what good humans have ever done, at the close of civilizational wheels. At what point do we actually become dynamically conscious in action in the preservation of our own species and our babies?
Well, I know that there are a lot of people who or in particular, many people who have gotten the shots who are now getting very, very angry after realizing that the shots are not what they're supposed to be. They're not helping any. They're not effective, not even 1% effective, and they're not safe either. On the contrary, the latest figures from your home country, from Great Britain, say that 92% of the people who die of COVID symptoms have been vaccinated. So that is a very good reason for people to stand up, to rise up and fight back. The big question is how best to do it. And I think the best way to do this is, rather than resorting to violence, which will only make matters worse, at least at this point, we should continue with our efforts to educate the people, to get out the truth, expose them over and over and over again, and at the same time, we must continue with our legal efforts. At least this is what the psychologists are telling us. Among them, Professor Desmet. You've probably spoken with him already, from Belgian University, and he says, so long as we keep talking, as we keep doing what we're doing, there's a good chance that not just us, the 30 or 40%, depending on where you are, who know what's going on, will turn the tide, but that others among the 40% who are still approachable, who are not hypnotized as the rest of the group, the 30%, if there's a good chance that many of the 40% will, while they're still sitting on the fence, will come off the fence and walk over to our side, and then things will get a lot better. But it may very well be that things are going to get a lot worse first.
Understood. Well, thank you for that. Dr. Richard Fleming, if I could bring you in, as a respected research scientist, you've studied and tested Pfizer's COVID-19 shots and have discovered many things that are very, very wrong with them. Can you explain some of these findings to us, please?
Well, after we did some of the clinical trials, it became obvious that one of the questions that should be phrased is what happens when these vaccines actually come into contact with red blood cells or human blood, because people think that an injection into a muscle means that the vaccines actually stay there. And they're vaccine drug biologics, whether they're gene therapy or anything else, and independent of how much immune response, that's how they're delivered into people. And we knew from the Moderna studies back from 2017, where they did lipid nanoparticles vaccines for influenza, that those vaccines traveled all over the blood, to the brain, the bone marrow, the liver, the spleen, the heart of these animals. So it was very clear these don't stay in one spot. So we've already taken, we have the analysis of the genetic sequences of Pfizer, Moderna, and Janssen, typically referred to as Johnson & Johnson. We know what those nucleotide-based sequences are. And one of the things we wanted to do was see what happens when it's delivered to the blood. So we have about 60 hours worth of videotape where we took people who'd been vaccinated, people who had not been vaccinated. We exposed them to all three of the vaccines under the microscope and then looked at them. And the astonishing thing is that once you deliver the vaccines into that blood sample, the red color of the erythrocytes, the red blood cells, turns pale gray. Now, red blood cells are red because they're hemoglobin combined with oxygen. So the addition of these vaccines could only turn them pale if that oxygen and hemoglobin can no longer come into contact. Well, they were open slides, so there's plenty of oxygen. Anybody who's ever seen blood drawn will tell you that as soon as the blood is drawn, the blood is red because it's exposed to oxygen in the air, unless you're a cardiologist like myself doing studies where we will draw blood from inside the heart or the lungs that's partially desaturated. Most people have never seen desaturated blood. The only way that could happen then is if the hemoglobin molecule actually changes so it's no longer able to carry oxygen. And we know that RNA or DNA outside of a regular cell is a prion, an abnormal protein that turns other proteins abnormal so they no longer work. We know that lipid nanoparticle vaccines merge directly with blood cells and all cells of the body. We also know from research that was done for cancer drug trials that the adenovirus virus vector that's used in Janssen AstraZeneca, we know that that directly attacks red blood cells. So the introduction of genetic material where it's normally not supposed to be at is a prion. Red blood cells are the only cells in the human body that don't have the ability to divide themselves when they're outside of the bone marrow. They don't have a nucleus. They don't have genetic material. They don't have ribosomes. And so it looks like the ability to get these vaccines into the red blood cells damages the hemoglobin permanently. And we watched it for many minutes. It didn't turn back. We watched the blood then begin to clump and clot ahead of schedule from what we normally would expect. So they cause the inflammothrombotic response, just like I presented in the theory in 1994. Now, the argument against this is, my goodness, you don't get that much of the vaccine in the blood, do you? And the truth is, you probably don't. However, what we do know is that once this genetic material is in the cells of your body, you're continuing to make these spike proteins and you're continuing to perpetuate this genetic material. And you should never see any drug added to red blood cells to your blood that causes a change. Now, we looked at normal saline. We looked at atropine, which is a drug basically used for heart rate. We looked at an anesthetic, all things that would be expected to get into your blood. And none of those caused any damage to red blood cells. So it wasn't the amount. It was the fact that the vaccines themselves have an effect on the hemoglobin carrying capacity and permanently change the hemoglobin. And what that also means is that not only can you not take the oxygen from your lungs and get it to your body, but the waste product in your body, the carbon dioxide, that can't be taken up by the hemoglobin, taken back to your lungs and breathed out.
Okay. I know this is a very reductive question, but there are at least 1 billion souls in the world today who are almost certainly asking the question of themselves or to themselves. Which of the vaccines, the popular ones, are the least destructive in your professional view when you consider AstraZeneca, Sinovac, Johnson & Johnson, Pfizer and Moderna, and even Sputnik or whatever the Russian one is called? Which one would you rate as the least destructive?
They're all destructive. This is not an option of finding the least destructive. That's kind of like asking whether you want to be shot with a 45 caliber bullet or a 38 caliber bullet. Both are going to do harm. There is no evidence to suggest that any of these are not a problem for humans. Every one of them has shown massive side effects. We have these arguments about the VAERS or the European trials and the numbers that are reported. You know, it doesn't matter to me whether VAERS is 100% accurate, 10% accurate, or 1% accurate. You know, leave the number the same, add 1 0 or 2 zeros. 20,000 people for deaths is enough deaths. You know, with swine flu vaccine, and I was an orderly caring for patients back when we saw swine flu vaccine. And at that point in time, at 25 deaths, mainstream media, 60 Minutes, did a dossier looking at the lies presented by the federal government, looking by the cover-up of Big Pharma. I think something like 52 or 53 people died. And I like to tell people that in the 1970s, when we were just apparently not a caring society, we just didn't care because nobody used those terms, 52 deaths was enough to get it stopped. Now we're just a loving society, and 20,000 people isn't enough to get it stopped. And right now, 60% of the US population has been exposed to this virus, a little bit less of that for the children. And Moderna is out there trying to push an emergency use authorization to vaccinate the children when there's no evidence. If you take the EUA documents and the emergency use authorization documents, and we've looked at them, I've done the statistical analysis, and you ask the question, do any of these vaccines statistically reduce the incidence of COVID or death? And the answer is they do not, but they are associated with adverse events. And there's no way in the world that anybody, if they came into my office and I said, Sacha, I want you to take this drug. Now, it's not going to do anything more for you than not taking the drug, but I want you to take it. Would you take it?
Right. Well illustrated.
Yeah. So it is ridiculous. And when you listen to the FDA and the discussion panels, and they say, we don't know what this will do for children. This was the last go round. The only way we're going to know is to actually do it on the children. The last group of people that got by with that reasoning process of we don't know what will happen, so we're just going to try it out on the people, were the people in Nazi concentration camps. And we took those people to trial. And that's the purpose of this Crimes Against Humanity tour, because my focus, and I will not stop until this happens, is to take this to as many places as we need to go to the attorney generals of each and every one of the states, and to demand that they convene a grand jury to obtain indictments on these criminals, to hold them criminally accountable. Once that first state happens, the rest will start happening, and they will mount a response against the federal government to see to it that these criminals are held legally liable.
I hope to that. Thank you, Richard, very much indeed. A little earlier, I think it was, I'm not sure if it was Reiner who mentioned it, or might even have been you, but our governments really aren't our own government. Someone mentioned that. And that is entirely true. Our governments do not belong to the citizenry or the people. And that's because of this stealth globalist Sabbatean agenda, which is colored with Nazification, National Socialism, and cultural Marxism, all the fucking same thing, if you ask me. Point being, the governments are not the utility of living souls any longer, men and women of the living soil. Not that they were ever intended thus. You speak, and I'm something of a cynic, and I've studied the Babylonian roots of the Catholic Church and its proxies, the corporations masquerading as governments in 200 plus vicinities around the world. Fact being that subsequent to the ritual sacrifice of the black skin, brown skin, red skin, and yellow skin peoples of the world through the papal bulls and doctrines of discovery 400 or 500 years ago, we have turned into an artificialized technocracy. And it is the foot soldiers and the functionaries of the satanic status quo that we describe loosely as the bureaucracy, the technocracy. So, Patrick, if I could bring you in, because this is your focus, in your view, what is a technocracy?
Well, originally, the technocracy movement was started in the early 1930s in response to the Great Depression. People were very convinced that capitalism was over altogether. It's a very dark time in history. And scientists and engineers, in particular at Columbia University, got together and figured out they could do something better. So they created an economic system from scratch. They remodeled everything, threw out all the trappings of free market economics and what they knew about capitalism at the time, and created a resource-based economic system that was going to be accounted for by energy rather than currency. Energy was going to be the lifeblood of this economic system. And they just happened to call it technocracy. It was that's just their name. It had to do with technology, obviously, but they were going to use what they considered the science of social engineering to moderate all of society without the benefit of any type of a political system that would represent the people. They even at the time called for FDR to declare himself dictator in order to implement technocracy directly. And the first thing they asked him to do is to send Congress home. Don't need them anymore, and just appoint those technocrats kind of like an org chart from the top down. They have the continental director and then subdirectors and so on. This whole movement was huge in the United States back then. They had over 500,000 card-carrying, dues-paying members across North America, including in Canada. And it kind of fizzled out finally in the late 30s, 40s, especially with the rise of World War II. The industrial engine started back up, capitalism didn't die, et cetera. But it had a resurgence, big resurgence in the early 1970s, when the concept was picked up by another Columbia scholar at the time, Zbigniew Brzezinski. Brzezinski caught the eye of David Rockefeller, and together they started the organization, the Trilateral Commission, in 1973, to what they called create a new international economic order. And this is kind of the genesis of modern globalization. And this is where we find ourselves today. In the 70s, the members of this global organization, the Trilateral Commission, didn't really want much publicity. We gave them some, they didn't like it. But today, the same crowd is in wide open view through the auspices of the World Economic Forum, for instance, founded originally by, well, it was mentored and suggested by Henry Kissinger originally, but it was Klaus Schwab who founded it, still is the director today. They're in the wide open spaces now, declaring boldly what they intend to do. And there's two things that they intend to do in order to accomplish their Great Reset. Number one is they're going to reset the economic system like they had hoped to do in the 30s. They're going to reset the social system as well, because that goes along with the economy. They want everything lined up in a row. And the other side of it is they want to reset humanity itself. They're very much transhuman minded, wanting to change the human condition, to merge it with technology, to change it from the inside out genetically, to create humanity 2.0, as if the current humanity 1.0 isn't good enough. They think that they can do better with genetic engineering. We find ourselves in this mess today by this global elite having declared war on humanity several years ago. It was before 2020, but 2020 represented the coup d'etat of this group that was bent on this new technology of, let's call it genetic engineering. It's really warmed over genetics from the 30s and 20s and 30s, but they took this tack that they're going to use genetic techniques to edit the condition of man, to change the condition of man. This very dangerous run up to where we are today. And it's such a big story that people can't hardly believe that it's possible. But they've been planning this coup for a very long time. And in 2020, early 2020, when the World Health Organization announced that there was indeed a pandemic, it was clear to me, having studied and been watching the technocrats move around the world, the same people were working overtime on the COVID thing, pushing the panic porn, pushing the policies and stuff that would just completely shred society. The same people that were operating within the United Nations before that, stumping, creating panic over climate change, global warming, that, seas are going to rise and we're all going to die. Same people, same computer model, same approach, same MO, it just different issue, different cause, if you will.
Yes.
And so I looked at that as the coup d'etat of this technocrat crowd, who apparently are just not attached to humanity the way most people are. They have a very strange view, and this goes way back in history, by the way, a very strange view of the world, that they and only they are the ones who can interpret what science should do. And this is pseudoscience by definition, of course.
Yeah.
But very dangerous ideology. And they're playing this out today, and it's still working today. And that, the importance of declaring whether crimes of humanity have taken place or not is so critical now, as we're kind of over the big hump right now of COVID. And it may go down, it may not go down, but it looks like it's going down. Now is the time to strike while the iron is hot, while people are coming out of this and, oh boy, I'm glad this is over. We need to strike while the iron is hot to put the stake in the ground on this crimes against humanity issue. And whether anybody prosecutes another story, I think some will, but we still need to say what we're doing. We still need to make the case to the American public in such a way that it is indisputable and people can't throw rocks at it. So
Indeed.
That's where we are.
Indeed. Okay. And just a quick question here. When you consider, because we're talking about globalism, we're trying to understand the atom seed of evil, so to speak, that has coursed its way through history, kind of promulgating and permissioning this status quo. When you look at the Davos salamanders, courtesy of one Klaus Schwab, and you understand the genesis of the Bilderbergs and the Trilateral Commission, Council of Foreign Relations, the Tavistock Institute, Pilgrim Society, the Fabianist cloisters, the Rhodes Round Tables, the Jesuitical enclaves, all of it. Where would you, in your studied research, pinpoint the atom seed of what we could loosely call evil today?
Well, I believe that modern globalization started in the early 1970s with the establishment of the Trilateral Commission by Rockefeller and Brzezinski. And, before that, they gave compelling arguments that the old patterns they were attacking didn't work. What they call the frontal approaches did not work, the frontal assaults. They declared in 73 that what they needed now is a different approach, which is going to be an end run around national sovereignty. Brzezinski wrote about that extensively, by the way. It's not just me saying that. And this end run around national sovereignty has been very effective over the last 45 plus years. It's been death by 1,000 cuts. And we all know today the shape that our nation is, for instance, in America is, we're in such dire shape today, and there was no frontal assault that got us to this stage. We were sliced to death by 1,000 cuts, and now we're trying to deal with it. And say, well, how can we recover and stop the bleeding? But
Right.
It may not be too late at this point. We still may have a chance to recover, but it's going to be tough, and it's going to require action and alarm right now. People want to understand things. The biggest problem we're dealing with right now is that people will not get alarmed over this. And before anybody takes action, they must have a sense of alarm. It's like touching the hot stove. You must be alarmed enough to where you're willing to do something to make a difference.
Indeed.
And this is part of the task of our tour right now, is to not just really accurately inform people, but to give them enough information where they will be alarmed for their future, that they can make a difference in their future by taking action now.
Very good. Last question, and it's a one-word answer. Given AI, transhumanism, and that enigmatic soup of mystery that it represents right now in the Gestalt, because we don't really know where it leads us. We have an inkling, but we don't really know. But what we do know is that the richest man on earth is only in his 50s, I think mid-50s. Elon Musk, friend or foe, in your estimation?
Foe.
Thank you. That's all you need to say. Boom, boom. Judy, I think you jumped back on here. I wanted to ask you, please, tell us about your new book, Ending Plague, A Scholar's Obligation in an Age of Corruption.
Well, that book published last year. I get kicked off my computer a lot, so I'm back on the phone. It published last August, and what's key about the book is it's in two parts. It's the first time ever in 40 years that Dr. Frank Rossetti, who is the person who really knew the crimes of Tony Fauci and Bob Gallo and the heads of the governments and what happened. So he knew, along with Luc Montagnier, we did isolate LAV, and we now appreciate that LAV was weaponized using gain of function studies into HIV so that Gallo, Fauci, et cetera, could have the patent on a virus, because the natural isolate LAV was a slow growing virus from Luc Montagnier's group of patients, and this is very definitely not the virus that is currently HIV. And in fact,
in the early 90s, Deborah Birx, Robert Redfield there, they did a little vaccine program inoculating the infectious molecular clones of HIV into the military in their experiment there in the 90s to develop vaccines for AIDS, giving many million soldiers here in America the envelope, the spike protein GP120, glycoprotein 120, which is the causative agent of the dysregulation of the adaptive immune response. So we know that from genetic tests, where just as with the bat feces in the cave in China, we found in China VP62, which is the infectious molecular clone from the laboratories at Fort Detrick, at Cleveland Clinic, around the world, where these infectious molecular clones are grown. So they're right there in Fort Detrick for the gain of function studies were done in order to patent the virus, because now I appreciate, and I think the whole world does, that you can't patent the natural isolate. And so everything that Luc Montagnier fought for. So our book Ending Plague is Frank Rossetti telling that story, his perspective on the events, and me as a woman technician, 15, 20 years younger than them, watching and listening and seeing the data and seeing the corruption and how the data were manipulated, to say that HIV caused AIDS, when in fact HIV never was the virus that was isolated. And in fact, it was injected into many in the early 90s and probably beyond. But we did tests on a lot of the victims of PTSD, Gulf War disease, cancer, and they had what was called PNL43, which was the N terminus of one of the deadliest infectious molecular clones. So how did an infectious molecular clone, the N terminus, which would be that envelope protein, that GP120, GP41, which we know from Luc Montagnier and his part in Ending Plague. We actually did quite a long interview with him, which we were blessed to have, where he and Dr. Rossetti, talked about, basically the data that they had been frustrated at how it had been misrepresented over the last 40 years. So we show in Ending Plague our perspectives. We talk with Stephanie Seneff. We talk with Christopher Shaw of aluminum damage in these shots. We talked with Frank Schallenberger, who of course did a lot of work in the days, Peter Duisberg. So we did the interviews of the people who had been maligned, who'd been misrepresented in my perspective. I showed really those scholars that honored their obligation then and now. Candace Pert, Peptide T. It should have all ended a long time ago, and we now appreciate that HIV is to AZT is to AIDS as SARS-CoV-2 is to remdesivir is to COVID, and what really killed millions of Americans is the plague of corruption. And this was an agenda to kill the vaccine injured of the last 4 decades, cover it up, call it something it wasn't, cremate the victim, destroy the evidence, and rewrite history with a control of now creating all of these so-called vaccines. They're not vaccines. They're manufactured viruses. I said today at the Save a Generation tour here in Florida, no, the XMRV now means xenotropic, manufactured monkey mouse, deadly retroviruses engineered into a tripartite chimera, a new virus. The the so-called vaccine is the deadliest bioweapons of all time, a contagious virus. That's what a lipid nanoparticle expressing a tripartite spike protein of HIV, XMRV, and SARS. That's what it is. It's not a coronavirus, it's a pararetrovirus. And you injected the deadliest, most contagious pararetrovirus of all time into tens of millions of people worldwide.
God bless you, Judy Mikovits. Dr. Reiner, I've got to ask you, for those who are not familiar, can you explain the model grand jury hearing of public opinion? What were the findings from the hearing, and what are the next steps?
Well, the reason why we decided to conduct this grand jury investigation model trial is that after having worked on this Corona committee for almost 2 years, we began to see that lots of people who tuned in couldn't get the full picture. That's because in each and every one of our sessions, we would speak to a medical expert, geopolitician, and we would get all these little pieces of the puzzle from them. That's the reason why we decided to try and put this into give the people a complete picture. We know that if this puzzle consists of 1,000 pieces, we don't have all of them yet, but at least we have 950 or so pieces. So the best way to do it, we decided, and that's not just us, the people working on the Corona committee, but it's also the international group of lawyers who has in the meantime joined us as lawyers. That's apart from the Corona Investigative Committee. There's a group of international lawyers who is cooperating in these things. We're helping other lawyers from other countries with the evidence that we have. But the problem is we needed to put it into one big piece of information. You can't do that in one day. So we decided we're going to do it in a legal proceeding that people understand. Most people understand what a grand jury investigation is about. It does not end with a verdict that needs to be enforced in any way, but it ends only with the jury deciding whether or not the evidence that they've been presented is enough to indict those who are, they call them putative defendants. And that's what this is based on. It's the grand jury proceeding, which is something that is done, or grand jury investigation, which is done in the United States. If you're after some bad criminals, you don't really want them to understand that you're after them. So you, without the opposing party's participation, you present your evidence to this jury, and then eventually you ask, is this enough? You start with an opening opinion, which is what we did. Then we presented all the evidence, and now this is still missing. This still has to be wrapped up. We're going to have our closing arguments, and we will in about 10 days. So this is the entire story wrapped into a legal proceeding, so that within 6 days or so, I think that's how long it took, within 6 days, people who are watching this will understand what is really going on. And most importantly, in order to understand that this is an agenda and this is nothing that happened overnight, most importantly, we had to have some geopoliticians, some historians like Patrick, because they lay the groundwork for understanding this.
Very good. Thank you. Richard, could you explain what the heuristic method is?
Well, the heuristic method is just simply the method, thousands of years old, where you present information to people, and people are intelligent enough to then take that information and make an informed decision. You don't approach it by telling people you must believe this. You present evidence and information that they're able to then go look at and reason on their own whether something makes sense. This is like Galileo. Galileo didn't get put under house arrest because he said that the earth revolves around the sun. He got put under house arrest because he said, listen, don't take my word for it and don't take the church's word for it. If you look at the sun and you look at the moon and you look at the stars and you look at the other planets, you too can figure this out. The truth will become obvious to you. And that's what got the church upset, because the church wanted everybody to just simply take their perspective, as opposed to you can do this. You know, when I left LA about a year and 2 months ago and was asked to come to Dallas, one of the things that we dealt with was the complexity of this information. But what really happened in that was the opinion of don't dumb it down. So you're not going to get a PhD or an MD or a JD by listening to me. That's not how it works. But you can make sense out of it. And one of the things that I've always done in my life is I have asked myself a question: what would the smartest man or woman I ever met say in this situation? Now, the smartest man I ever met was a man who had an 8th grade education that grew up during the Great Depression and was a farm family. He married the smartest woman I ever met, who had a 12th grade education and could have been any type of scientist on this planet that she wanted to be. And they were from very smart people too. Now, those people, had you not guessed already, were my parents. And I asked a fundamental question: if my mom or my dad would have listened to this and said there is something really, really wrong here, I take that as a lesson in, common sense that everybody should pay attention to. So heuristic method is you ought to be able to present information in such a way that an intelligent person can take that information and say, you know what, this is what's really going on. And that's really what we're doing here with this tour, is presenting information that may sound complex, and in some regards it is, but the common sense of the average everyday individual is strong enough that they know in the end who's telling them the truth and who's lying to them. And you know what happens to liars? In the end, they have a great deal of difficulty sticking with their story because they have to keep changing it. Just like Tony Fauci, when Senator Dr. Rand Paul puts him on the witness stand before the committee and says, what is gain of function? And Anthony Fauci starts to say, well, it's not the same thing it used to be. We've decided a few years ago, and it's not my fault that. And I have a slide in this presentation where I show a cow and a horse, and it's pre-2019. And post-2019, well, we're now calling a horse a cow and a cow a horse, because we want to change the definition. And no matter how much they circle around and run and try to manipulate the data, you can see they're lying to you. And I had somebody on the jet coming here, and I had a taxi driver yesterday that I was talking to explaining this, and their responses were the same. They didn't know what it was, but they knew something wasn't quite right. And they had both taken and decided they weren't going to get vaccinated. They weren't going to be masked. They weren't quite right and quite certain why. And to see the look on their face when enough information was given for them to say, I get it, that is well worth the effort. But we're going to do more than just educate the people. The people will go after these folks and indict them, because in the United States, the U.S. Constitution is an agreement. It's a compact between the federal government and the states. And the states get their power from the people. And the states then give their power to the federal government. But the federal government doesn't have any power that the states don't have. And the states don't have any power that the people don't have. And the people don't have the power to force other people to get vaccinated or to be masked or to do any of this other stuff. All of these things that happen that we're fighting for are unconstitutional. So I'm not fighting for me to take these people to court. I'm fighting for a grand jury to put these people in court and let we the people decide. And we the people owe it not only to ourselves and the people we care about, but we owe it to our children and our grandchildren, and we owe it to the rest of the world, because the rest of the world is looking to see what we the people of the United States of America will do. This country is an outstanding country, but we have criminals in certain places that have taken power that they've been allowed to have, and it's time to take it back.
Beautifully stated indeed. Thank you. Patrick, you've been studying the history of all of this hoo-ha for a long time. I'm very dear friends with G. Edward Griffin and David Icke and Sean Stone and other, in my view, great researchers on the subject. And I've spent the best part of 25 years surfing that some labyrinthine subterranean enigmas in much the same way that you do and have done for a long time. But in your studies, how far back does the globalist, and in a sense, I'm kind of repeating a question I asked earlier, just trying to drill down a bit further to the source, to the source code. How far back does this globalist elite agenda go? I mean, can you trace it back to Sumerian times, Babylonian times?
Well, I suppose you can make at least some philosophical traces back before 1970 for sure, back to 1900, 1800, whatever. The game is being played out though in modern history here at what we call maybe the third level of modernity in the world. And this new globalization that we have today that we're dealing with is new. Versus pre-1970, I believe. And I think really that was a genesis of modern globalization was in the early 1970s. Having said that, you ask how long, how far back does this go? I would bring it forward just a little bit and point out that the famous Rio de Janeiro conference that took place in 1992 that coined Agenda 21 and sustainable development. That's where that doctrine was created by the United Nations. All of this, was kind of a smokescreen back in 1992 for genetic modification. And there were people who wrote about this at the time, and I've checked a number of United Nations documents since then to verify this. But two particular critical authors of that day wrote a book in 1994 about what happened in Rio de Janeiro. And there was two things. There was Agenda 21 and there was a biodiversity convention. They both ran in parallel, same conference, just two tracks. And here's what they wrote. This was astounding. I didn't really see this clause before 2020. But they said in their book, they said the convention, that's a biodiversity convention, implicitly equates the diversity of life, animals and plants, to the diversity of genetic codes. By doing so, diversity becomes something modern science can manipulate. It promotes biotechnology as being, quote, essential for the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. And they went on to say that the main stake raised by the Biodiversity Convention is the issue of ownership and control over biological diversity. The major concern, they said, was protecting the pharmaceutical and emerging biotechnology industries. That's what they saw as critics from the other side, not our side necessarily, but they were environmentalists and so on. They went to Rio thinking, hey, we're going to get some results here, some good stuff going. They came away disillusioned, and that was their conclusion. This is what we see today, that, we've seen Monsanto has taken over the seed domain. We've seen insects go to, for instance, Oxitec, where modified insects, genetically modified insects now are being used all over the place. You've seen all kinds of plants, grasses, and so on have been genetically modified. Animals have been modified, cattle and pigs and sheep. You've had fish that have been genetically modified to grow twice as fast in a farm as they would out in the ocean. Every conceivable form of life on Earth has already been genetically modified because of 1992 up through 2020. What changed with 2020 is that finally the same people, the same crowd that did the other genetic modification of life on Earth finally set their crosshairs on humans themselves. And this is the first time in the history of this whole thing that somebody has decided it's okay to use genetically modifying techniques on humans. very dangerous. And there's been a lot of discussion about, of course, well, it's messenger RNA, and but then there's some people now that say, yep, we've proven that they can be transcribed backwards into your DNA now. But in India, there is a company, a big pharma company there, that has created a so-called vaccine that actually is based on DNA and is injected under the skin instead of in the muscle. So, these scientists are unplugged from the rest of humanity. They think somehow they have some divine right to simply make changes to the human condition, to the human body, whether it's playing with your immune system or some other, issue of your life. Most people, once they understand this, reject it so forcefully. I mean, it just makes you sick to your stomach when you realize what these people have done. This is the crimes against humanity. This would even make Adolf Hitler blush at this point. He would have loved to have this kind of technology back then. But it's over the top and it's in your face today. And people, we see all this talk about genetic modification. We're going to make things better. We can do better this time. Just give us a chance. Say, no, we don't want to give you a chance. You don't deserve a chance. You people are completely nuts and unplugged. Get your needle out of my arm, get your needle out of my body, get your eyeballs off of my DNA or whatever else is my immune system, whatever else is my body, and leave me the heck alone.
Right. Well, very good. I mean, human health sovereignty, that's in 101. That's really that has to be the root. That's got to be the source code of where we take our civilization, so to speak. I even despise the words, civilization. You talk about civic, go back to the emperors of Rome and the Caesars and paying coin, to surrendering unto Caesar, all that bullshit. I mean, the needle to me is government. And government, as we know, the etymology is mind control. And government is the franchise of the Catholic Church as it ran amok subsequent to the weaponization of Christianity in the Council of Nicaea. And prior to that, we've got oceans of blood that we need to swim through to understand the darkest and deepest roots. Not all bad. It's a checkerboard for sure. I want to salute each of you for doing what you're doing with this Crimes Against Humanity USA tour. I rather suspect it might catalyze into something planet-wide. And if I could just close with you, Dr. Reiner Fuellmich, there's some political ambition there, I hope, and many of us hope in you, with the political party that you are, Democratic Party that you are I think you're chairing, forgive me, you're chairman of the board in the leadership of a grassroots Democratic Party. Now, I don't get the spelling. Is it D basis or die basis? Forgive me.
Yeah.
What is it called?
It's Die Basis, which is German for the base, and it is about grassroots democracy. Yes, this is probably the only political party in Germany that is fighting what's going on, that's fighting the corona measures, and that is what brought the people together. Many of them seem to have been watching our corona committee, and eventually, after they had set up this party, months after they had started to work in this party, they came and asked Vivian and myself if we wanted to play a role in this, and we said yes, we're going to join that party because. And I hadn't been to the polling booths in 8 years or so. I'm completely. I didn't want anything to do with politics. But we joined that party, and about a year later, we were asked if we wanted to lead this party, and so we decided, why not? We're going to do it. If we are going to be in politics, then let's do our best to make a difference. What this party is about is, one, we're fighting the measures. Two, we realize that the system itself cannot be salvaged. This system is probably dying before our very eyes right now. And therefore, we've decided we shouldn't fight the system, but rather we should set up our own system in our regions. That's what grassroots democracy, Die Basis, the base, is all about. Set up your own brand new system of education, economics, judiciary, and I said education, economics, judiciary, and healthcare, of course. Set it up in your own region so that it's tailor-made to the needs of the people in that region. We don't want any global corporation or global NGO that's run by these psychopaths to tell us what we have to do. We know much better what's good for us. And this is going on already in Germany, in the United States, and other countries as well. This does not mean that we're not connected. No, we should connect these individual regional, I guess you could call them competence centers, whatever, of 10,000 or 20,000 people. Connect them, exchange the best ideas, and thus make this a better world. You do need real democracy. Democracy is always bottom up. What we're seeing now is top down. This is not democracy. It has nothing to do with democracy. That's the reason why we joined this party.
Very good, very good. He said, turning to the audience, well, that's bringing us to the close of this fantastic panel, which I've thoroughly enjoyed. And this is the pyrite stone that I bought for Kirsten W. at Christmas time. Was about to hand it to her as she was landing in Malibu, but she collapsed, was dragged off to a hospital, stuck on an incubator and perished. Robert David Steele, my erstwhile friend and colleague, perished as well mid-tour on an incubator. General Mackay, Scott McKay's father, died after being zapped front row at our Penn State event. A bunch of Navy SEALs and all of my technical team and myself became very gravely ill. 2 people in the front rows of the audience died. Grandmother Charlene Walking Bull from the Lakota, who very kindly gave me and the Arise tour the blanket at the end of our tour, perished as well. I hope that their spirit of activism, true red-blooded activism, is carried along with each of you on this Crimes Against Humanity tour across the United States. Nash Singh, thank you for putting this together. Dr. Richard Fleming, an absolute delight to learn from you. Patrick Wood, wonderful to learn from you as well. Reiner Fuellmich, I've been so looking forward to meeting you for the last 2 years. And Judy, you're still my favorite pinup. Love you dearly. And thank you all very much for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Peace and love. Enjoyed the tour. And I'm going to try and nab you all at the back end of the tour for another panel session. God bless you.
Great.
God bless
Thanks.
you.
Thanks for doing this. Bye-bye.
Thank
you. Yes.
All right, friends, that ends today's broadcast. Much love. Please stay tuned. Read the threads in all of the syndicated sites that you're going to see this film on. Follow the tour. Follow each of these incredible icons. Learn.